The Flannan Isles Mystery. 3 lighthouse keepers who vanished. On December 15th, 1900, a supply ship called the Hesperus arrived at the Flannan Isles Lighthouse off the western coast of Scotland, coming to deliver provisions and relieve the keepers as part of the routine rotation. But when the ship's crew approached the small rocky island, they noticed something wrong. No flag flew from the lighthouse pole. No signal acknowledged their arrival. No keepers appeared on the landing to assist with unloading. When the relief keeper Joseph Moore went ashore and climbed to the lighthouse, he found the station completely deserted, the building secured and in order except for one detail. 3 men who should have been there were simply gone, had vanished without leaving any indication of where they went or what had happened to them. The table was set for a meal that was never eaten. 2 of the 3 oilskin coats that the keepers used for outdoor work in harsh weather hung on their pegs, while the 3rd was missing, suggesting that 1 man had gone outside while 2 remained inside. But all 3 were gone. The clocks had stopped. The logbook contained entries up to December 13th, documenting routine observations, and then a strange final entry that mentioned a severe storm, though no storm had been recorded by nearby stations during those dates. And the log contained notes that suggested the keepers had been disturbed or frightened by something, with references to praying and to one keeper crying. Details that seemed completely out of character for experienced lighthouse men who had weathered countless storms without such emotional displays. The final entry was dated 2 days before the relief ship's arrival, leaving a 48-hour gap when something happened that caused 3 grown men to vanish completely from a small island with no means of escape except by boat. And no boats were missing, and no bodies were ever found, despite extensive searches of the rocky shores and the treacherous waters surrounding the island, leaving only questions, only the empty lighthouse with its stopped clocks and its uneaten meal. Only the mystery of how 3 men could disappear from a location with no apparent way to leave. With no evidence of violence or struggle. With no storm or accident that would explain their simultaneous disappearance, creating one of maritime history's most enduring mysteries. One that has generated theories ranging from the mundane to the supernatural. That they were swept away by a freak wave while checking equipment on the cliffs. That they were taken by some human agency for reasons unknown. That they encountered something on the island or in the surrounding waters that caused them to flee or be taken. That they fell victim to murder-suicide though no bodies or weapons were found. That they experienced something so terrible that it drove them into the sea, leaving the Flannan Isles Lighthouse as monument to sudden disappearance, to the fragility of human presence in remote locations, to the way people can simply cease to exist, leaving only the spaces they occupied, and the questions about what happened in those final hours when 3 lighthouse keepers, who should have been safe in their routine occupation, instead vanished completely, leaving no farewell, no explanation, no bodies, no resolution. Only the empty lighthouse standing witness to whatever occurred on December 13th or 14th, 1900, when Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur became part of history's unsolved disappearances. 3 men who were there and then weren't, who left behind only mystery and speculation and the haunting image of the empty lighthouse with its stopped clocks and its silent testimony to something that happened, but that was never explained, never solved, never understood, despite over a century of investigation and theorizing, leaving the Flannan Isles mystery as permanent question about what can happen in isolated places, what forces, natural or otherwise, can make people vanish, what the sea and the rocks and the lonely lighthouse witnessed when 3 men disappeared into absence, into mystery, into the permanent unknown. The official investigation conducted shortly after the disappearance concluded that the most likely explanation was that the men had been swept away by a massive wave while attempting to secure equipment on the cliffs during rough weather. Evidence supporting this included damage to equipment storage boxes located high above normal water level, suggesting waves of exceptional size had struck the island. The missing oilskin coat indicated at least one keeper had gone outside, and the theory proposes that when he encountered danger, or when the first keeper failed to return, the others went out to help or investigate, and that all three were then caught by a rogue wave that swept them into the sea, leaving no bodies because the currents around the Flannan Isles are powerful and would carry bodies far from the island rapidly. This explanation accounts for several facts: the simultaneous disappearance of all three men, the lack of bodies, the absence of signs of violence, the secured lighthouse suggesting no panic or rushed departure. But it struggles with other details. If the men were experienced lighthouse keepers, familiar with the dangers of the location, why would they all go outside during dangerous conditions? Why would the second and third keeper follow if they saw the first in danger, rather than securing themselves and reporting the incident when relief arrived? The log entries mentioning storm conditions don't align with weather records from nearby stations that showed relatively calm conditions during the relevant period, suggesting either that the Flannan Isles experienced localized weather that wasn't recorded elsewhere, or that the log entries were fabricated or were describing something other than actual storm conditions. The strange log entries are among the most debated elements. According to accounts from the relief keeper Joseph Moore, who discovered the empty lighthouse, the log contained unusual final entries describing severe storms and noting that keeper Thomas Marshall had been crying and that all three men had been praying. These emotional displays seem uncharacteristic of experienced keepers who would have endured many storms without such reactions, suggesting either that the storm was exceptionally severe in ways that terrified even experienced men, or that something else was happening that the keepers coded as storm in their official log, or that the log entries have been embellished or misremembered in the century since the event, becoming more dramatic through repeated retelling than the actual entries were. Skeptics note that the original log wasn't preserved and that accounts of its contents come from secondary sources, including poetry written about the incident, creating possibility that the dramatic elements, the crying, the praying, the disturbing final entries, are literary inventions rather than historical facts. Without access to the original log, we can't verify what it actually contained versus what later narratives attributed to it, making this crucial piece of evidence fundamentally uncertain. The lighthouse itself was found in good order, suggesting no panic or rushed departure. Beds were made, dishes were cleaned, the lighthouse was secure, as if the keepers expected to return shortly. This orderliness argues against scenarios involving sudden terror or emergency that would cause abandonment of the station. It suggests that whatever caused the disappearance either came upon them suddenly, while at least one was outside, or that they left intending to return quickly, expecting their absence to be brief, not realizing they would never return. The missing oilskin is significant because it indicates one keeper went outside while two remained inside. But all three vanished, suggesting that the two indoor keepers subsequently left the lighthouse, presumably to help or investigate when the first keeper encountered trouble or failed to return. This sequential departure seems more consistent with trying to help someone in trouble than with all three being simultaneously swept away. Though the final result, all three missing, could occur in either scenario if the helping keepers were also caught by the wave or whatever other force caused the initial disappearance. The theories beyond freak wave range into more speculative territory. Murder-suicide proposes that one keeper killed the other two and then himself, disposing of bodies in the sea. Though this requires explaining why, requires motive that wasn't evident in any prior behavior or relationship problems among the keepers, and requires explaining how bodies were disposed of without trace and why the lighthouse showed no signs of violence or struggle. This seems among the least likely explanations given available evidence. Abduction by passing ship, perhaps smugglers or foreign agents wanting to darken the lighthouse for navigation-related purposes, is theoretically possible but seems unlikely. The keepers would have resisted, creating evidence of struggle. A ship approaching the difficult waters around Flannan Isles purely to abduct keepers seems improbable. And what would be the motive? If the goal was to extinguish the light for a short period, killing the keepers on site would be simpler than abducting them. The theory doesn't align well with the evidence or with plausible motives. The sea serpent, or unknown marine creature theory, invokes cryptozoology, suggesting the keepers encountered something in the waters around the island, something that took them or that frightened them into fatal decisions. This has no direct evidence supporting it, but appears in speculation, particularly in earlier decades, when sea monsters were taken more seriously as possible explanations for maritime mysteries. Modern skepticism about large unknown marine animals makes this explanation seem implausible, though it captures something of the unknownness of the incident, the sense that something beyond normal experience occurred. The supernatural theories are inevitable given the remote location and the complete disappearance. Stories emerged of phantom ships, of curses on the lighthouse, of the keepers being taken by spirits, or by the sea itself, as if it were a conscious entity claiming what was always meant to be claimed. These narratives serve literary and cultural functions, transforming a mystery into a morality tale or horror story. But they don't explain what actually happened in ways that can be evaluated against evidence. The psychological theory proposes that isolation and the stress of lighthouse keeping might have caused collective psychological breakdown, that the keepers might have experienced shared delusion or panic that led them to abandon the lighthouse and throw themselves into the sea, or to make irrational decisions that resulted in their deaths. This requires explaining what would trigger such breakdown, why it would affect all three simultaneously, or sequentially, and why the lighthouse showed no signs of preceding psychological distress beyond the possibly embellished log entries. The time gap between the last log entry and the discovery of the empty lighthouse means we don't know exactly when the disappearance occurred. If the log entries are accurate, and the last entry was December 13th, the men could have vanished any time in the following 48 hours before the relief ship arrived on the 15th. This window allows for various scenarios, including that weather conditions deteriorated after the last log entry, that the men faced some emergency that developed after they stopped maintaining the log, or that something happened that prevented them from continuing to document their situation. The lack of bodies is explained by the powerful currents around the Flannan Isles if the men entered the water, whether through accident, force, or choice. Bodies wouldn't necessarily wash up on the island itself, but would be carried by currents far into the Atlantic, making recovery effectively impossible with 1900 search capabilities, and making it unsurprising that no remains were found. This doesn't tell us how the men entered the water, but does explain why physical evidence of their fate wasn't recovered. The similar disappearance patterns in other lighthouse and maritime contexts suggest that remote locations, dangerous weather, and the unpredictable power of the sea create conditions where people can vanish without trace. The Flannan Isles case is distinctive in that all three keepers vanished simultaneously or near simultaneously from what should have been a relatively secure location. But the basic pattern, people disappearing near water without bodies being recovered, is unfortunately common enough in maritime history that the Flannan case, while mysterious, isn't necessarily anomalous in requiring exotic explanation beyond natural forces and human vulnerability. The cultural impact has been significant, with the Flannan Isles mystery, inspiring poetry, songs, books, and speculation far beyond what the objective evidence warrants. The image of the empty lighthouse, the stopped clocks, the set table, the 3 missing men. These elements combine into a narrative that captures imagination, that seems to demand explanation more elaborate than they were swept away by a wave, that invites speculation and elaboration, that transforms a tragic accident into an enduring mystery. Whether this cultural elaboration has obscured the likely mundane explanation, or whether it reflects genuine intuition that something unusual occurred, remains debatable. The keeper who discovered the empty lighthouse, Joseph Moore, was reportedly deeply affected by the experience, and his testimony about what he found provides most of our information about the lighthouse's condition. His reliability and the accuracy of his reporting are crucial but difficult to assess over a century later. Did he accurately describe the stopped clocks, the uneaten meal, the strange log entries? Or did memory and later elaboration embellish a fundamentally simpler scene? We can't interview him, can't examine the original evidence he observed, can't verify the details that have become central to the mystery. The Northern Lighthouse Board's investigation was thorough by the standards of the time, but was hampered by lack of physical evidence, by the days that had passed before the discovery, by the impossibility of determining exactly when the disappearance occurred. Their conclusion, freak wave, remains the official explanation, and remains the most plausible given available evidence, though it's an explanation that satisfies by elimination rather than by positive proof, that we accept because other explanations seem even less likely, rather than because we have clear evidence of a wave sweeping the keepers away. Whether the Flannan Isles mystery represents tragic accident during severe weather, represents some other natural but unpredicted disaster, represents human agency that wasn't detected or understood, or represents something genuinely anomalous that we lack frameworks to explain. The case endures as a reminder that people can vanish, that mysteries can remain unsolved despite investigation, that some questions persist not because we lack imagination to explain them, but because we lack evidence to definitively resolve them, leaving us with the facts. 3 men were there, then weren't, left behind a secure lighthouse and stopped clocks and questions that a century hasn't answered, leaving the Flannan Isles Lighthouse standing as it stood in 1900 when the relief keeper arrived to find it empty, standing as monument to disappearance, to mystery, to the fragility of human presence in remote places where the sea is powerful and the rocks are unforgiving, and where 3 men vanished in ways that were never explained, never resolved, never understood beyond the probable but unprovable conclusion that they went outside during dangerous conditions and were swept away by waves that left no evidence except absence, except empty spaces where keepers should have been, except stopped clocks marking the moment when routine ended and mystery began, leaving the Flannan Isles as they remain, remote, dangerous, haunted by the absence of 3 men who vanished there, haunted by questions about what happened in those final hours, haunted by the mystery that persists because we can't interview the witnesses who are gone, can't examine the evidence that the sea claimed, can't definitively determine what force, natural or otherwise, caused Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur to disappear from the Flannan Isles Lighthouse on or around December 13th, 1900, leaving their story as permanent mystery, permanent absence, permanent testimony to how people can vanish from isolated places, leaving only questions, only speculation, only the image of the empty lighthouse with its stopped clocks standing witness to whatever occurred, to whatever took 3 men who were there and made them not there, who transformed routine lighthouse keeping into enduring mystery, who became part of history's catalog of unexplained disappearances. joining the countless others who have vanished without trace, without explanation, without resolution, leaving only the spaces they occupied and the questions about what happened, what force, natural or supernatural or human, removed them. What the Flannan Isles witnessed when 3 keepers disappeared into mystery that a century of investigation and speculation hasn't resolved, hasn't explained, hasn't closed, leaving the case as it began. 3 men gone, no bodies found, no definitive explanation, only the likelihood that they were swept away by waves and the lingering possibility that something else occurred, something we haven't considered or can't imagine, something that makes the Flannan Isles mystery more than tragic accident and transforms it into genuine unsolved case, into permanent question about what can happen in remote places where people live isolated from help, where the sea is powerful and unpredictable, where 3 lighthouse keepers who should have been safe in their stone tower instead vanished completely, leaving only mystery, only absence, only the lighthouse standing empty with its stopped clocks and its silent testimony to the day when 3 men were there and then weren't, when the Flannan Isles claimed them, or the sea claimed them, or something claimed them, leaving us to wonder what that something was. What force or circumstance or fate removed 3 grown men from their secure location and left no evidence except their absence, no explanation except speculation, no resolution except the unsatisfying acknowledgement that some mysteries resist solution, that some disappearances remain unexplained, that the Flannan Isles mystery is among them, permanent testimony to the way people can vanish, to the way questions can persist across centuries, to the way 3 lighthouse keepers became part of maritime legend by disappearing completely from the remote island where they kept the light, leaving the lighthouse empty, the clocks stopped, the mystery unsolved, the questions permanent, the 3 men gone forever into whatever took them on December 13th or 14th, 1900, when the Flannan Isles Lighthouse became the site of one of history's most enduring disappearances. 3 men who vanished completely, who left no farewell, who became mystery, who remain mystery, who will likely always remain mystery unless the sea yields secrets it has kept for over a century, unless evidence emerges that wasn't available to investigators at the time, unless the Flannan Isles Lighthouse finally reveals what it witnessed when 3 keepers disappeared from their station and entered history as the men who vanished, the mystery that endures, the absence that defines the case. 3 lighthouse keepers who were there and then weren't, gone into mystery that remains, that persists, that defines the Flannan Isles as site of unsolved disappearance, as place where 3 men vanished, as location haunted not by ghosts, but by questions, by absence, by the permanent mystery of what happened when the lighthouse keepers disappeared. The elevator game, riding between dimensions. There's a game that circulates through online communities and urban legend exchanges, instructions that claim if you follow a specific sequence of button presses in a particular type of elevator, a building with at least 10 floors, riding alone, performing a precise ritual of ascending and descending in a pattern that makes no practical sense, you can access an alternate dimension, a parallel version of reality that exists alongside our own, but that's normally inaccessible, separated by barriers that the elevator game somehow allows you to breach. The instructions are specific. Enter the elevator alone. Press the buttons in sequence. 4th floor, 2nd floor, 6th floor, 2nd floor again, 10th floor. And when you reach the 10th floor, don't exit even if someone enters. And if a woman enters on the 10th floor, whatever you do, don't look at her, don't speak to her, don't acknowledge her presence because she isn't human. She's something else, a guardian or entity that exists at the threshold between dimensions. If she speaks to you, remain silent. If she doesn't enter, or if you successfully ignore her, press the button for the 5th floor. And if the elevator goes up instead of down, if it ascends past the 10th floor to somewhere that shouldn't exist, you've succeeded in crossing over to the other world. The alternate dimension where everything looks almost like our reality, but wrong. Empty, red-tinted, where you might be the only person, where electronics don't work properly, where the rules are different, and where leaving requires performing the ritual in reverse. If you can find an elevator that still functions, if the woman doesn't prevent you, if you remember the sequence correctly, if the dimension allows you to leave at all. Hundreds of people claim to have played the elevator game, some reporting that nothing happened, that they rode elevators pressing random buttons and felt foolish for believing internet legends. But others claiming they did cross over, that they experienced the other world briefly before fleeing back, and a very few claiming they went too far, stayed too long, encountered things in that empty red world that they won't describe, but that left them changed, that made them understand. The elevator game isn't game at all, but is genuine doorway to somewhere we're not supposed to go, somewhere that exists parallel to our reality, accessible through this bizarre elevator ritual that sounds like creepypasta nonsense until you try it and discover that maybe, impossibly, the instructions actually work, that elevators can be portals, that dimensional travel is possible through precise manipulation of architectural spaces that weren't designed for this purpose, but that somehow, under specific conditions, with specific sequences, allow crossing between worlds that normally remain separate, leaving players with the choice of whether to believe the warnings, whether to attempt the ritual, whether to risk encountering the woman on the 10th floor, and discovering whether the other world is real, or whether the elevator game is just another urban legend, another internet myth that preys on human desire to believe that magic and mystery still exist, that hidden dimensions wait behind the mundane architecture of apartment buildings and hotels, accessible to anyone brave or foolish enough to ride alone through the sequence, through the pattern that either opens doorways between realities or just makes you look absurd, pushing elevator buttons in strange order, depending on whether the game works, whether the other dimension exists, whether the woman is real, and whether you're willing to find out. The elevator game appears to have originated in South Korea, circulating in online communities as El Ribiteo Game, before spreading internationally through creepypasta sites, Reddit threads, YouTube videos, and other platforms where urban legends and ritual games propagate. The Korean origin is significant because elevator-related supernatural beliefs are particularly strong in East Asian cultures, where elevators and other liminal transitional spaces are often associated with spiritual activity, where the boundary between floors or levels is seen as threshold where different realms can touch, where spirits can enter our world, or where humans can accidentally cross into spirit realms. The specificity of the instructions gives the ritual an air of authenticity, as if these are genuine directions for a real phenomenon, rather than fictional elements of a story. The exact button sequence, 4th, 2nd, 6th, 2nd, 10th, has variations across different versions of the game, but the core structure remains consistent. A pattern that requires moving between floors in a sequence that makes no practical sense, that would be inefficient for any normal elevator use, that serves no purpose except as ritual, as formula, as the specific combination that allegedly opens the doorway. The woman who appears on the 10th floor is described consistently across accounts as wearing dark clothing, having long dark hair covering her face, emanating a sense of wrongness or danger that makes players instinctively want to leave the elevator immediately. She's identified in some versions as not being from our dimension, as being a guardian or test, as something that players must resist interacting with to proceed further. The specific warning not to look at her, not to speak to her, parallels folklore from multiple cultures about encounters with supernatural entities, where acknowledgement or interaction creates connection or danger. where ignoring the entity is the safest response, even though every instinct screams to react to someone entering your elevator. The detail that the elevator will ascend when you press the 5th floor button, going up instead of down despite being on the 10th floor, is the moment that supposedly indicates successful dimensional crossing. An elevator ascending from the top floor violates the physical constraint that should prevent it, suggesting you've left normal space-time where the 10th floor is the highest point, and entered a space where the elevator can go beyond the building's actual structure, where architectural limits no longer apply because you're no longer in the architecture you started in, but rather in its dimensional reflection or alternate version. The other world is described as red-tinted or lit by red light, as being mostly empty of people, as having familiar architecture but wrong atmosphere, as a place where you might see distant lights or shapes, but no actual people, or where the only other person you encounter is the woman who has followed you or who exists in both dimensions. Electronics are said to malfunction, phones don't work, cameras fail, the normal connections to the wider world are severed, leaving you isolated in this alternate space with no way to call for help or document what you're experiencing. The escape instructions involve returning to the elevator, pressing the button sequence in reverse, or in a different pattern that supposedly returns you to normal reality, assuming you can find an elevator that operates, assuming you remember the sequence, assuming the dimension allows you to leave. Some versions warn that you must leave before a certain time limit, that staying too long causes you to become stuck, unable to return, trapped in the empty alternate world permanently. Others warn that the woman will try to prevent your departure, will appear in the elevator, will speak or touch you, to create connection that anchors you to the alternate dimension and prevents return. The documented attempts are numerous but difficult to verify. YouTube contains countless videos of people claiming to attempt the elevator game. Though most show nothing unusual, people pressing buttons, riding elevators, experiencing normal elevator behavior, sometimes claiming they felt strange or scared, but without any objective documentation of dimensional crossing. The handful of videos that show unusual events, elevator lights flickering, strange sounds, the elevator moving in unexpected ways, are ambiguous, potentially explainable through normal elevator malfunction or through video editing and hoaxing. The compelling accounts come from text-based stories shared in paranormal communities, detailed first-person narratives of people who claim they performed the ritual and experienced the crossing, who describe the red-tinted world, the emptiness, the overwhelming desire to leave immediately, the terror of being alone in a dimension that looks almost like home, but that's fundamentally wrong. These narratives are effective horror writing regardless of their truth status, creating visceral sense of wrongness and isolation that resonates psychologically, even if the events described never actually occurred. The question of whether anyone has actually crossed dimensions through the elevator game versus whether people have experienced psychological states that they interpreted as dimensional crossing is central. Elevators are inherently disorienting spaces, enclosed, moving, with limited sensory input, designed to be transitional and temporary. Performing a ritual in an elevator, focusing attention on buttons and floors, and watching for anomalies creates heightened state of awareness and anxiety that could produce perceptual distortions, could make normal elevator behavior seem strange or significant, could generate strong emotions and experiences that feel real, even if they're purely psychological. The ritual elements create self-fulfilling prophecy potential. If you believe the game works, if you're nervous and hyper-alert while performing it, if you're primed to interpret any unusual sensation as evidence of dimensional crossing, your perception and memory can construct experiences that seem to validate the belief. The woman on the 10th floor might be any person who happens to enter at that point, transformed in memory and perception into the supernatural entity the ritual describes. The red tinting might be perceptual artifact of stress and reduced oxygen in enclosed space, or might be suggestion creating visual experience that isn't externally real, but that feels genuine to the experiencer. But this psychological explanation, while plausible, doesn't account for the specific consistency across reports, the particular details that appear in independent accounts. The fact that people attempting the game without believing in it sometimes report unusual experiences that disturb them enough to share despite their skepticism. Either the psychological effects of the ritual are powerful enough to produce consistent hallucinatory or perceptual phenomena across different individuals, or something else is happening that we don't have framework for explaining. The dimensional travel hypothesis takes the game literally, proposes that elevators under specific conditions and through specific manipulation can create portals or interfaces with parallel dimensions. This would require physics far beyond current understanding, would require that dimensions exist adjacent to ours in ways that architectural spaces can bridge, would require that human intention or ritual can affect dimensional barriers, creating access where normally none exists. The mechanism by which pressing elevator buttons in sequence would open dimensional doorways isn't specified and isn't apparent from any known physics, making this explanation scientifically untenable but narratively compelling. The tulpa or egregore interpretation suggests that the elevator game has become real through collective belief, that the thousands of people who know about it and think about it and attempt it have created genuine phenomenon through focused attention and expectation, manifesting the woman and the alternate dimension through the power of shared mental energy, or through mechanisms of consciousness that materialism doesn't acknowledge. In this framework, the game works now because enough people believe it works, regardless of whether it worked originally, or whether it was ever intended to be real rather than fiction. The dangers, if real, are emphasized in the warnings that accompany the instructions. Players are cautioned to ensure they can complete the ritual, to not stay in the alternate dimension longer than necessary, to avoid the woman at all costs, to follow the return sequence exactly, to be prepared for the possibility that return might not be possible. These warnings serve narrative functions, building tension, creating stakes, making the game feel consequential. But they also serve protective functions if the phenomenon is real, warning off casual attempts while providing safety guidelines for those determined to try. The comparison to other ritual games is inevitable. Bloody Mary, the Midnight Man, the Three Kings, and numerous other ritual practices that circulate through youth culture and online communities share characteristics with the elevator game: specific instructions, alleged supernatural results, warnings about dangers, mix of believers and skeptics, and difficulty determining whether any of it is real versus purely psychological or fictional. These games serve social functions, create shared experiences, test courage, provide frameworks for exploring fear and mystery, whether or not they produce genuine supernatural effects. The liminal space aspect is central. Elevators are quintessentially liminal, spaces of transition, neither here nor there, between floors, between destinations, temporary enclosures where normal social rules are suspended and where strangers are forced into uncomfortable proximity. This liminality makes them psychologically potent, makes them feel like spaces where unusual things might happen, where normal reality might be less stable. The elevator game exploits this existing psychological association, using the inherent strangeness of elevator space to create ritual that feels like it should work, that feels appropriate to the space it utilizes. The persistence and spread of the game demonstrate its cultural resonance. It continues to circulate years after first appearing, continues to attract new participants, continues to generate reports and discussions and warnings. This persistence suggests it's serving psychological or social needs: need for mystery, for experiences that transcend mundane reality, for shared cultural practices that create bonds and stories, for testing personal courage against alleged supernatural threats. Whether the game actually produces dimensional crossing becomes almost secondary to its function as cultural practice, as shared mythology that gives meaning and structure to elevator-related anxiety and liminal space discomfort. The question of whether you should attempt the elevator game, if you're curious, ultimately depends on what you believe and what you're looking for. If you're seeking verifiable proof of dimensional travel, you're unlikely to find it. The experiences reported are subjective and ambiguous, not producing physical evidence that could convince skeptics. If you're seeking personal experience of mystery and fear, the ritual might provide that regardless of whether anything supernatural occurs, purely through the psychological effects of performing the ritual in isolation, of focusing attention on possibility of the uncanny, of creating conditions where perceptual anomalies feel significant. The elevator game exists in the space between real and fictional, between psychological and supernatural, between cultural practice and genuine phenomenon. It might be nothing more than creepypasta that's been taken seriously by people who want to believe in accessible magic and hidden dimensions. It might be psychological exercise that produces powerful subjective experiences through ritual and suggestion without anything objectively unusual occurring. Or it might be, impossibly, what it claims to be: actual technique for accessing alternate dimensions through elevator manipulation, doorway, hidden in plain sight, ritual that works for reasons we don't understand, through mechanisms we don't possess frameworks for analyzing, making the woman on the 10th floor real, making the red world real, making dimensional travel possible for anyone willing to ride alone through the sequence and risk discovering that the warnings were accurate, that some games aren't games, that some rituals produce real effects, and that elevators designed merely to move people between floors can, under specific conditions, become something else entirely, become portals, become thresholds, become access points to dimensions that exist parallel to our own, waiting behind the architecture, accessible through the pattern, through the ritual, through the elevator game that thousands have attempted and that remains forever ambiguous, forever uncertain, forever hovering between elaborate hoax and genuine mystery, between psychological phenomenon and dimensional doorway, between creepypasta and reality, leaving players to decide for themselves whether to press the buttons, whether to ride alone through the sequence, whether to find out if the woman appears, whether to discover if the elevator ascends when it should descend, whether to learn if the other world is real, or if they'll simply ride a normal elevator, pressing random buttons while feeling foolish for believing internet legends about dimensional travel through elevator ritual, about games that aren't games, about architectural spaces that become portals, about the woman on the 10th floor who guards the threshold, about the red world waiting just beyond normal reality, accessible allegedly through this bizarre sequence of button presses that either opens doorways between dimensions or does absolutely nothing except waste time and make you look strange to anyone watching elevator security cameras, leaving the elevator game as it is and as it will likely remain: popular, persistent, disturbing, compelling, unverified, ambiguous, possibly real, and possibly fictional. Definitely effective at generating experiences that people interpret as significant whether or not anything supernatural actually occurred, making it perfect modern urban legend, perfect internet age myth, perfect liminal space ritual that exploits elevator psychology and dimensional possibility and human desire to believe that hidden worlds exist and that access requires only knowledge of the sequence, only willingness to ride alone, only courage to face the woman if she appears, and to enter the red world if the elevator ascends. discovering finally whether the elevator game works, or whether it was always just story, always just legend, always just another creepypasta that people wanted to believe in badly enough that they convinced themselves it was real, riding elevators, pressing buttons in strange patterns, searching for dimensional doorways that either exist or don't, that either open or don't, that either lead to alternate realities or lead only to disappointment, and the realization that not every ritual produces magic, that not every legend describes truth, that sometimes elevators are just elevators, and button sequences are just button sequences, and the woman never appears because she was never real, and the other world doesn't exist because dimensions don't work that way. And the elevator game is simply game, simply fiction, simply one more way. Humans try to inject mystery into mundane architecture, to find portals in ordinary spaces, to believe that somewhere, somehow, just beyond the normal world, alternate dimensions wait, accessible to anyone who knows the pattern, who performs the ritual, who plays the elevator game, and discovers whether it works or whether they've been fooled by internet legend into pressing random buttons alone in elevators, hoping for dimensional travel that never comes. That was never possible. That exists only in stories and in the perpetual human hope that maybe this time, this ritual, this sequence, this elevator will be different, will open the doorway, will prove the legend true, will take them to the other world where the rules change and reality becomes fluid, and nothing is quite what it seems. The red world, the empty world, the alternate dimension that might be real or might be fiction, but that remains forever accessible in imagination. And perhaps, just perhaps, through the elevator game, through the sequence, through the ritual that continues to spread and continues to be attempted, and continues to generate experiences that people interpret as proof or as delusion depending on their frameworks and their beliefs, and whether they think dimensional travel through elevator manipulation is possible or impossible, leaving the question open, leaving the game available, leaving the instructions circulating through internet communities, where they'll continue to find new players, new believers, new skeptics, new people willing to ride alone through the sequence to discover for themselves whether elevators can be portals, whether dimensions can be crossed, whether the woman is real, whether the other world exists, whether the elevator game is genuine doorway, or elaborate fiction that convinced thousands of people to press buttons in strange patterns while hoping for magic that never manifests, that was never there, that might never have been real except in the collective imagination where the elevator game lives permanently. Accessible to all, verifiable by none, existing in perpetual uncertainty between urban legend and hidden truth. The Eskdale state, government mind control through deep hypnosis. There exists a level of hypnotic trance so deep that most people don't even know it's possible. It's called the Eskdale state, named after James Eskdale, a Scottish surgeon who worked in India during the 1840s. Eskdale discovered that he could place patients into a trance so profound that he could perform major surgeries without any anesthesia, without the patients feeling pain, without them even remembering the procedures afterward. He documented hundreds of successful operations conducted on people in this state, operations that would normally cause excruciating agony. The patients would lie completely still, their bodies relaxed, their minds seemingly disconnected from physical sensation. When they emerged from the trance, they had no memory of what had been done to them. This historical medical curiosity raises an unsettling question that has occupied the minds of conspiracy theorists for decades. If a person can be placed into a state where they feel nothing, remember nothing, and remain completely compliant, what else could be done to someone in this condition? The Eskdale state is deeper than ordinary hypnosis, deeper even than what hypnotherapists typically work with. In normal hypnotic states, people remain aware of their surroundings, can resist suggestions, and maintain some degree of conscious control. But in the Asdale state, these barriers seem to dissolve. The conscious mind becomes so quiet, so removed from active processing, that the subconscious takes over completely. The body can become cataleptic, limbs remaining in whatever position they're placed, breath slowing to an almost imperceptible rate. Some researchers describe it as being similar to the deepest stages of sleep, where the brain enters delta wave patterns, except the person remains suggestible, responsive to specific voices and commands, while being completely detached from normal waking consciousness. The theory that intelligence agencies have weaponized this state emerged during the Cold War, when both the United States and the Soviet Union were obsessively researching mind control techniques. We know from declassified documents that programs like MKUltra explored hypnosis extensively, testing whether it could be used to create assassins, extract information, implant false memories, or turn ordinary people into unwitting agents. The CIA's own documents acknowledge attempts to induce hypnotic states for operational purposes, though they claim these experiments were largely unsuccessful. But critics point out that the very nature of deep hypnosis means subjects wouldn't remember being used, wouldn't know they had been programmed, wouldn't retain conscious awareness of what had been done to them. How would we know if it worked? The Asdale state offers capabilities that go beyond traditional hypnosis. In this profound trance, the barriers that normally protect the mind from external influence become extremely thin. Suggestions can be planted at a level that bypasses critical thinking, embedded into the subconscious without the normal filters that would reject or question them. A person in this state could potentially be given instructions, false memories, or behavioral triggers that would activate later without their understanding of where these impulses came from. They would believe their actions were their own choices, their memories authentic, their motivations genuine, the perfect cover for covert programming. Some researchers who have worked with the Asdale state describe accessing what they call somnambulistic trance, a level where the subject can walk, talk, and perform complex actions while remaining completely hypnotized. Their eyes might be open, they might respond to questions, they might appear awake and aware, but they're actually operating from a completely altered state of consciousness. When brought out of this trance, they remember nothing of what occurred, as if those minutes or hours simply never existed. Imagine the applications for intelligence work. A person could be brought into this state, given information or instructions, and then return to normal consciousness with no awareness that anything had happened. They could be a perfect courier, a perfect spy, a perfect asset, carrying information or programming they don't consciously know exists. The question of whether someone can be hypnotized against their will is one that mainstream hypnotherapists typically answer with a firm no. They maintain that hypnosis requires consent, cooperation, relaxation. But this assumes ordinary hypnotic induction techniques and ordinary circumstances. What about situations involving drugs, sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, trauma, or other methods that break down mental resistance? We know from MKUltra documents that researchers combined hypnosis with substances like LSD, barbiturates, and other compounds specifically to bypass normal defenses. We know they explored trauma-based techniques, methods that would shatter the psyche to make it more malleable. In such conditions, could someone be forced into an Asdale state without their consent? The historical record suggests intelligence agencies certainly believed it was worth trying. There are accounts, difficult to verify but persistent, of people who claim to have lost time, to have gaps in their memory that they can't explain. They describe feeling compelled to go to certain places or do certain things without understanding why. Some report dreams or fragmented images that feel more like memories, clinical settings, voices giving instructions, sensations of being unable to move. Under hypnotic regression conducted years later, some of these individuals describe being placed in deep trance states, being given commands, being programmed for purposes they didn't understand. Skeptics attribute these to false memories, to the power of suggestion during the regression itself, to the mind's tendency to create narratives to explain the unexplainable. But what if some percentage of these accounts reflect something real? The Esdaile state also relates to theories about sleeper agents, individuals who live normal lives until activated by a specific trigger. In espionage fiction, this is dramatic and obvious, but the real application would be far more subtle. Someone programmed in an Esdaile state might not even be tasked with dramatic acts. They might simply be positioned to pass along information when prompted by the right phrase or signal, or to make certain decisions when they find themselves in specific positions of influence, or to remain silent about things they've witnessed. The beauty of using such deep programming is that the person would have no conscious knowledge of their role, no guilt or nervousness to give them away, no information that could be extracted even under interrogation because they genuinely don't know. Historical documentation shows that James Esdaile's work was initially celebrated and then largely suppressed after chemical anesthesia became available. The medical establishment moved away from hypnotic anesthesia, partly because it was unpredictable. Not everyone could be placed into a sufficiently deep trance, and it required significant skill and time. But it also made people uncomfortable. There was something disturbing about the level of control it represented, the way it seemed to remove a person's will and awareness so completely. When Esdaile's techniques were demonstrated in Europe, they met with skepticism and even hostility from some quarters, as if the medical community sensed something dangerous in this level of mental manipulation, something that shouldn't be freely available. Modern hypnotherapists who have studied the Esdaile state report that it requires deep trust and significant time to induce. The subject must be guided down through multiple levels of trance, past the light relaxation of initial hypnosis, through deeper stages where visualization and suggestion become more vivid, and finally into a state so deep that the body's normal processes seem to pause. Breathing becomes shallow, heart rate drops. The person appears to be in something close to a comatose state, yet they remain responsive to the hypnotist's voice. This voice becomes their entire reality, the only input they process, the only guidance they follow. The level of influence possible in this state is profound and unsettling. The theory that governments have refined these techniques suggests they've developed methods to induce the Esdaile state more quickly and reliably than Esdaile himself could. Perhaps through pharmaceutical assistance, perhaps through technologies that we don't have public knowledge of, perhaps through selection processes that identify individuals who are naturally highly susceptible. Intelligence agencies have access to resources that academic researchers don't, the ability to conduct experiments that would never receive ethical approval, and motivation to perfect techniques that could provide significant operational advantages. If even a fraction of the MK Ultra budget and effort was dedicated to hypnotic programming, and if they achieved even partial success, the implications are staggering. There's also the question of what happens to someone who is repeatedly placed into these deep states. Does it change the brain structure or function? Does it make subsequent inductions easier? Could someone be programmed to enter the Esdaile state upon hearing a specific trigger word or phrase, allowing them to be accessed and reprogrammed whenever needed? Some theories suggest that victims of sustained mind control programming develop dissociative disorders, their psyches fragmenting under the repeated trauma of having their consciousness manipulated. These fragments, sometimes called alters, could each hold different programming, different memories, different instructions, all hidden from the person's primary consciousness. The challenge with evaluating these theories is that the very nature of the Asdial state means evidence would be almost impossible to find. Subjects wouldn't remember. Documents would be classified. Operators would be trained to leave no trace. Anyone who came forward claiming to have been programmed would be easy to dismiss as mentally unstable or attention-seeking, especially since their own memories of the events would be fragmented or absent. This creates a perfect conspiracy, one that by its very nature is almost impossible to prove or disprove, because successful implementation would leave no conscious witnesses and no accessible evidence. We do know that governments have shown consistent interest in controlling human consciousness and behavior. From Nazi experiments to Soviet psychiatry to American intelligence programs, the historical record is clear that powerful institutions have dedicated enormous resources to understanding and manipulating the mind. Hypnosis represents one avenue of that research, and the Asdial state represents the deepest level of that avenue, the point where the mind becomes most vulnerable, most accessible, most completely under external influence. Whether this potential has been fully realized, whether there are people walking among us carrying programming they don't know exists, whether intelligence agencies have mastered the art of creating unconscious assets, these questions remain in the realm of theory and speculation. But the foundation is real. The Asdial state exists. Deep hypnotic trance can remove pain, memory, and conscious will. People can be guided to do things and then forget they did them. These are documented facts, not speculation. The question is only how far this has been taken, how much has been developed in classified programs, how many of the theories about government mind control through deep hypnosis reflect actual capabilities rather than paranoid fantasy. And because the nature of the programming would erase itself from the subject's memory, because the techniques would be buried under classification, because those who know won't talk, and those who talk don't know, we may never have a definitive answer. The Asdial state remains what it has always been, a doorway into the deepest reaches of human consciousness, a place where the boundaries of self become fluid and vulnerable, and where, in theory at least, one mind can completely control another without leaving a trace. The Leviathan, something massive moving under the ocean. The ocean covers more than 70% of Earth's surface, and we've explored approximately 5% of it. The remaining 95% remains as alien to us as the surface of another planet. A vast liquid realm where pressure reaches crushing extremes, where light cannot penetrate, where terrain includes mountains taller than Everest and trenches deeper than the atmosphere is high, where entire ecosystems function in complete darkness, sustained by volcanic heat rather than solar energy. In this unexplored frontier, sailors, researchers, and military personnel occasionally detect something that defies easy explanation. Sonar contacts that are too large, too fast, or too organized to be geological features. Signals that suggest biological activity on a scale that doesn't match any known species. Movements in the deep ocean that imply something massive and alive, something that has remained hidden in the abyss because we simply haven't looked deeply enough or carefully enough to discover it. They call it the Leviathan, invoking the biblical sea monster that represented chaos and the untamable power of the ocean. And whether it's a single creature of impossible size, a species of enormous deep-sea animals, we haven't yet documented, or something else entirely, a phenomenon we're misinterpreting as biological when it might be geological or technological or something outside conventional categories. The evidence continues to accumulate that something massive moves through the ocean depths, something that sonar occasionally catches, something that leaves traces and effects that suggest presence without providing clear identification, something that has adapted to the deep ocean so completely that it may never surface, may never enter depths where humans can easily study it, may remain in those unexplored 95%, where the pressure and darkness provide perfect concealment for something whose size and nature would fundamentally alter our understanding of what the ocean contains, what lives in its deepest reaches, what moves beneath the surface beyond our sight, and mostly beyond our detection. The evidence begins with sonar contacts, the pings and returns that submarines and surface vessels use to map underwater terrain and detect objects. Military submarines have occasionally tracked contacts that appear biological, objects that move with purpose rather than drifting with currents, that change depth and direction in ways that suggest agency, that appear on instruments as massive returns indicating something far larger than any known marine animal. These contacts are typically classified because submarine operations and capabilities are military secrets. But occasionally, personnel speak off the record about tracking something that shouldn't exist, something that was too big, that moved too deliberately, that disappeared into depths where following was impossible or dangerous, leaving the crew with the certain knowledge that they detected something, but with no ability to identify what it was, or to prove it existed to anyone who hadn't seen the sonar displays themselves. The bloop is the most famous acoustic detection associated with speculation about massive, unknown marine life. In 1997, hydrophones deployed by NOAA as part of their ocean monitoring network detected an ultra-low frequency sound of extraordinary power, loud enough to be recorded by sensors over 5,000 kilometers apart. The sound had characteristics consistent with biological origin. It matched the profile of sounds produced by marine animals rather than geological or man-made sources. But its volume suggested a source far larger than any known animal, larger even than blue whales, which produce the loudest known biological sounds. NOAA eventually attributed the bloop to ice quakes, the cracking and fracturing of ice sheets as they break and move, explaining the volume and characteristics without requiring unknown biology. But the initial interpretation that the sound might be biological, combined with its immense power, sparked widespread speculation about what could produce such a sound if it wasn't ice, but rather something alive, something so large that its vocalizations or movements created acoustic signatures detectable across ocean basins. Witnesses from ships describe encounters that don't make news, but that accumulate in maritime lore. Crews report seeing disturbances in the water too large to be whales, massive swells or movements that suggest something enormous just beneath the surface, shadows glimpsed in deep water that extend beyond what any known animal's size would account for. Occasions where the sea itself seems to rise or shift in ways that indicate displacement of water by something underneath with volume that exceeds normal marine life. These accounts are typically dismissed as misidentification of whales, schools of fish, submarines, or geological features. But witnesses insist that what they saw was different, was larger, was something that their experience with the ocean told them didn't match anything they'd encountered before. Giant squid were considered cryptozoological mythology until specimens were finally documented in the 19th and 20th centuries, proving that creatures of enormous size can live in the deep ocean effectively hidden from human observation for millennia. Colossal squid, even larger, were discovered more recently. These discoveries demonstrate that the ocean can conceal megafauna, that extremely large animals can exist in the depths without being readily observed by surface-dwelling humans, that science's catalog of marine life remains incomplete and likely contains significant gaps. If squid reaching 12 to 14 meters can remain largely unknown until recently, what else might exist in deeper waters, in regions less accessible than the depths where giant squid hunt? The megalodon, the enormous prehistoric shark, is frequently invoked in speculation about the Leviathan. Megalodon lived until roughly 2 to 3 million years ago, reached lengths estimated at 15 to 18 meters, and was apex predator in the oceans it inhabited. It's officially extinct, but occasional claims surface of evidence suggesting survival into modern times. Teeth that appear too recent, sightings of sharks of impossible size, arguments that the deep ocean could support a relict population. Mainstream science considers megalodon survival extremely unlikely, given the lack of evidence and the ecological requirements such a large predator would have. But the possibility that some large prehistoric marine species persisted in isolated deep ocean environments cannot be absolutely ruled out without comprehensive survey of the entire ocean, which remains technically and economically unfeasible. The pressure and environment of the deep ocean create conditions where massive size might be sustainable or even advantageous. Deep-sea gigantism is documented in various taxa. Squid, isopods, and other creatures grow larger in deep ocean environments than their shallow water relatives. The mechanisms aren't fully understood, but might relate to metabolism, temperature, food scarcity, or other factors unique to the abyss. If something adapted specifically to the deepest oceanic environments, it might achieve sizes that shallow water or surface animals can't sustain, becoming truly massive while remaining in depths that humans rarely access and that conventional marine biology surveys don't reach. Military interest in ocean anomalies is documented but largely classified. Submarine operations depend on distinguishing contacts, on knowing what's natural, what's man-made, and what doesn't fit either category. Sonar operators are trained to identify sounds and returns, to categorize what they detect. When they encounter something that doesn't match training or experience, that appears biological but too large, or that moves in ways known animals don't, the information gets recorded and analyzed. Some of this analysis reaches scientific communities, but much remains classified either because revealing it would expose submarine capabilities or locations, or because what was detected is itself considered sensitive information that might have national security implications if foreign powers learned about whatever is in the ocean producing these contacts. The Ningen is a specific manifestation of the massive marine life legend. Reports primarily from Japanese whale research vessels operating in Antarctic waters. Crew members describe seeing enormous white creatures, roughly humanoid in shape but clearly marine, observed at distances and in conditions where details are unclear, but where the overall impression is of something very large and very strange, something that appears biological but whose form doesn't match known whales or other marine life. Photographs and video allegedly exist but remain ambiguous, showing pale shapes in dark water that could be ice, could be whales, or could be something else. The reports are dismissed as misidentification or hoax, but they fit into the broader pattern of witnesses encountering something in the ocean that they can't identify, that seems too large to be anything known, that leaves them with the certain impression they saw something science hasn't documented. Submarine canyons and deep ocean trenches provide habitat where large creatures could live without regular human observation. The Mariana Trench, the deepest point in the ocean, has been visited by humans only a handful of times. The Hadal Zone, depths below 6,000 meters, remains largely unexplored and represents enormous volume of habitat where biological adaptations to extreme pressure would be required, but where, once adapted, creatures might grow to sizes that can't be supported in shallower waters. If the Leviathan exists, these trenches and canyons would be logical habitat, deep enough to avoid most human activity, extreme enough that special adaptations would be required that most marine biologists wouldn't expect or look for. Vast enough that a population of large creatures could persist without regular detection. The biomechanics of extremely large marine animals are theoretically challenging but not impossible. Water provides buoyancy that reduces the structural requirements compared to land animals, allowing larger sizes than terrestrial creatures can achieve. The largest known animals, blue whales, already demonstrate that marine environments can support sizes exceeding anything that can exist on land. If conditions and evolutionary pressures favored even larger size, particularly in deep water, where pressure and temperature create different physical parameters than surface water, creatures larger than blue whales might theoretically exist, though they'd require enormous food resources and would face challenges in terms of reproduction, oxygen acquisition, and temperature regulation that would need novel adaptations. The conspiracy angle suggests military and governments know more than they publicly acknowledge about what exists in the ocean, that detection systems more sophisticated than publicly available technology have mapped and tracked large unknown contacts, that decisions have been made not to disclose because the information would cause economic disruption to fishing and shipping, would raise questions about ocean resource exploitation, or would reveal capabilities and operations that remain classified. If something massive does live in the ocean, international cooperation would be needed to study or protect it, which creates diplomatic and legal complexities that might motivate suppression of information until proper frameworks can be established. The question of whether the Leviathan is a single individual, a species, or multiple separate phenomena being grouped under one label affects interpretation significantly. A single enormous creature would raise questions about its lifespan, its origin, how it came to be unique, and what happens when it dies. A breeding population would require ecological analysis of what sustains them, how many exist, what their range is, and why they've avoided documentation. If multiple separate phenomena are being called Leviathan, a combination of large unknown species, geological processes, submarine activities, and misidentifications, then there's no single thing to discover, just a collection of ocean mysteries that share the characteristic of being larger than expected and difficult to identify. The psychological dimension involves how humans process the ocean and its mysteries. The deep ocean is genuinely alien, genuinely unexplored, genuinely capable of concealing things we haven't imagined. The vastness and inaccessibility create mental space where projection and speculation flourish, where the fact that we don't know what's there allows us to populate it with monsters, with impossible creatures, with things that exceed the bounds of known biology. The Leviathan might be as much about human relationship with the unknown as about any actual creature, a symbol of what remains beyond our control and understanding. A reminder that even on Earth, there are frontiers we haven't conquered and that might contain things we aren't prepared to encounter. Whether the Leviathan exists as biological entity, as multiple species of large undiscovered animals, as phenomenon we're misinterpreting, or purely as legend and misidentification, the concept endures because the ocean genuinely could conceal it. The unexplored 95%, the extreme depths, the vast volume of water, all provide plausible habitat for something that science hasn't documented. Until comprehensive survey of the entire ocean floor and all its depths is completed, an undertaking that would require resources and technology that don't currently exist, the possibility remains that something massive lives down there, something that moves through the abyss where we can't follow, something that occasionally brushes against our detection systems and leaves us wondering what we glimpsed in sonar, or in deep water. What massive presence created that displacement or that acoustic signature? What still lurks in the ocean that would fundamentally change our understanding of marine life if we could finally document it completely? Rather than catching these fragmentary glimpses, these suggestions, these traces of something enormous that the deep ocean holds and protects from our observation, maintaining its mystery across the centuries, across the millennia. The Leviathan swimming through depths we can barely reach, remaining just beyond clear detection, continuing to move beneath the surface where something that large shouldn't be able to hide, but where the ocean's vastness and our limited exploration create perfect conditions for concealment, leaving us to wonder whether the ancient legends of sea monsters were fanciful imagination, or whether they were attempts to describe encounters with something real, something that still exists in the ocean's depths, something massive and alive and unknown, waiting in the abyss, moving through water too deep and too dark for easy study. The Leviathan that science hasn't confirmed but can't definitively rule out. That remains possible until we finally explore enough of the ocean to either discover it, or to be certain that the depths contain no creatures of the size and nature that reports suggest, leaving us suspended between belief and skepticism, between the possibility that something magnificent and terrifying lives in the ocean, and the probability that what witnesses have seen is explicable through conventional biology and misidentification, but never quite certain, never quite able to dismiss completely the idea that somewhere in the unexplored vastness of the deep ocean, something massive moves, something that would deserve the name Leviathan if we ever manage to prove its existence, if the ocean ever yields its secret and shows us what's been hiding down there all along, what's been moving beneath the surface of every sea and ocean, just beyond our ability to clearly observe and document and understand. The Leviathan that is either real and waiting to be discovered, or imaginary and waiting to be finally dismissed, but that until then remains one of the great mysteries of the unexplored ocean, a possibility we can't eliminate, a creature or phenomenon or something else that might exist in the 95% we haven't seen, swimming through the darkness, moving through pressure that would crush human bodies, existing in an environment so extreme and so vast that hiding even something massive becomes plausible, becomes possible, becomes the explanation for why, after all our ocean exploration, we still can't definitively say what lives or doesn't live in the deepest reaches where the Leviathan allegedly dwells, where sonar occasionally catches something, where witnesses sometimes see disturbances too large to easily explain, where the mystery persists and likely will persist until either discovery proves it real or exhaustive survey proves it false, leaving the Leviathan as it has always been, something that might exist, something massive moving under the ocean, something that captures imagination precisely because it remains unproven and unprovable, residing in that space of possibility where legends live until evidence either kills them or confirms them. And the Leviathan, swimming in the abyss, remains alive as legend because the ocean is large enough to hide it, deep enough to conceal it, unexplored enough to make its existence plausible despite our skepticism, despite our science, despite our certainty that we would have found something that large by now if it existed, a certainty that the ocean's unexplored 95% quietly contradicts. The Hat Man, a shadow figure seen across all cultures. He appears at the foot of your bed in the deepest hours of night, a silhouette darker than the surrounding darkness, wearing what looks unmistakably like a wide-brimmed hat, and sometimes a long coat or cloak. He doesn't move, doesn't speak, just stands there watching with attention that feels malevolent and ancient, radiating a presence so oppressive that breathing becomes difficult and moving is impossible. You're awake but paralyzed, conscious but helpless, aware that something profoundly wrong is in your bedroom, and there's nothing you can do except endure its scrutiny until it decides to leave or fade away. This is the Hat Man, and he's been appearing to people across every continent, every culture, every demographic for decades at minimum, and possibly for centuries. Witnesses who've never heard of each other describe him in identical terms. The hat, the watching, the overwhelming dread, the sense that this isn't human and never was, that you're being observed by something that exists outside normal reality, something that studies humans the way we might study insects, with detached curiosity mixed with something darker that none of the witnesses can articulate, but all of them feel with absolute certainty when they see that silhouette standing motionless in their darkened room. The consistency of descriptions across independent witnesses is what elevates the Hat Man from random nightmare into genuine phenomenon. People who've never researched shadow figures, who've never read horror stories or paranormal accounts, wake up and see this entity, and when they later search online trying to understand what happened to them, they discover thousands of reports describing exactly what they saw. The wide-brimmed hat that looks like something from the Old West or vintage detective films, the long coat or cape, the absolute blackness of the figure that seems to absorb light rather than merely blocking it, the sense of three-dimensional presence despite being composed entirely of shadow. The hat is the signature element, the detail that transforms shadow person into specifically the Hat Man, and its consistency across cultures that have different historical relationships with hats and different fashion contexts makes its uniformity even stranger. Most encounters occur during sleep paralysis, the state where consciousness returns before the body's motor control reactivates, leaving you awake and aware but unable to move or speak. Sleep paralysis is well documented medically, a glitch in the mechanisms that prevent us from physically acting out dreams, and it frequently includes hallucinations. Seeing figures in the room, feeling pressure on the chest, sensing malevolent presence. The standard medical explanation for the Hat Man is that he's a cultural archetype, a shared image that appears during these vulnerable states because our brains are pattern-seeking and construct threatening figures from ambiguous sensory input when we're paralyzed and frightened. Different cultures see different entities during sleep paralysis based on their mythologies: old hags, demons, aliens, shadow people. And the Hat Man is simply the Western contemporary version, an amalgamation of film noir, detectives, gunslinger imagery, and Grim Reaper aesthetics, producing a figure that feels archetypal and threatening. But this explanation struggles with the cross-cultural consistency. The Hat Man appears in countries where fedoras and wide-brimmed hats aren't culturally significant. To children too young to have absorbed film noir aesthetics, to people in remote areas with limited media exposure who wouldn't have access to the shared cultural database that supposedly creates his image. A child in rural Indonesia describes the same figure as a college student in Ohio. An elderly woman in Norway sees the same silhouette as a teenager in Brazil. The hat and coat aren't universal symbols of menace. They're specific to certain Western time periods and genres. Yet the Hat Man transcends these boundaries, appearing identically to people who have no reason to generate that specific image from their cultural programming. The Hat Man doesn't always appear during sleep paralysis. Some witnesses report seeing him while fully awake and mobile, standing in hallways, visible in peripheral vision, watching from corners or doorways before vanishing when looked at directly. These daytime sightings lack the paralysis element that skeptics use to explain him as hallucination, yet the figure remains consistent: the hat, the coat, the darkness, the watching. He's been photographed in a handful of cases, or at least dark anomalies in photos have been interpreted as possibly being him, though like all paranormal photography, the images are ambiguous enough to support multiple interpretations and definitive enough to convince those who already believe. The emotional impact of encountering the Hat Man is severe and consistent. Witnesses describe terror that exceeds normal fear, a primal dread that suggests encountering something fundamentally wrong, something that violates basic assumptions about what should exist. Many report the fear lingering for days or weeks after the encounter, disrupting sleep, creating anxiety about entering bedrooms or being in darkness. Some develop insomnia, afraid to sleep because sleep might bring him back. Others report recurring encounters, as if once he's appeared, he continues returning, as if being noticed by him creates a connection that persists beyond the initial sighting. The sense of being studied is what many witnesses emphasize most strongly. He's not attacking, not threatening in any overt way, but his attention feels predatory and violating. You're being assessed, examined, cataloged. He's there for a purpose that relates to you, but that he'll never explain, and his complete stillness and silence make the experience more disturbing than active menace would. It's the patience of something that exists outside human timescales, that can stand and watch for as long as it wants, because it doesn't get tired, doesn't get bored, doesn't operate according to human limitations. The watching implies intelligence, consciousness, intention. This isn't random atmospheric manifestation, but an entity with agency who's chosen to appear and observe you specifically. Theories about what the Hat Man actually is span the full range of paranormal frameworks. In supernatural interpretations, he's a demon or malevolent spirit, something ancient that predates humanity, that feeds on fear or negative emotions and manifests during sleep paralysis, because that state makes humans particularly vulnerable to psychic or spiritual intrusion. The hat and coat might be adopted affectations, appearance elements he wears, because they increase fear in modern humans, or they might be his actual form as perceived through the filter of human visual processing. Our brains translating something that doesn't have physical form into the closest visual analog we can construct. Jungian psychology might interpret him as a shadow archetype, the collective unconscious manifesting as an external figure during altered states of consciousness. The hat marks him as other, as not belonging to the immediate time and space, as something from outside that's intruding into the personal sanctuary of the bedroom. He represents death, threat, the unknown, all the aspects of existence that consciousness tries to exclude, but that lurk always at the edges. During sleep paralysis, when the normal barriers between conscious and unconscious are compromised, he breaks through, becomes visible, manifests as external entity, even though he might originate from the deepest layers of human psyche. Interdimensional theories propose he's a being from parallel reality or adjacent dimension, something that exists in spaces that overlap with ours, but aren't normally accessible to human perception. Sleep paralysis or certain states of consciousness might temporarily thin the barriers, allowing us to see into dimensions that coexist with ours, and the Hat Man is a resident of those spaces who becomes visible during these moments of overlap. He's always there, always watching, but only sometimes visible when conditions allow cross-dimensional perception. The hat and coat might be his actual appearance, or might be how our visual cortex interprets sensory data from an entity that doesn't properly translate into our dimensional physics. There are also theories connecting him to alien abduction phenomena, suggesting he's a screen memory or camouflage used by non-human intelligences during encounters they don't want remembered clearly. The paralysis, the bedroom setting, the sense of being examined, these match abduction accounts. Perhaps what people interpret as the Hat Man is actually alien entities conducting observations or procedures, with the Hat Man image serving as psychological cover, a less technologically threatening figure that human minds construct to replace memories of the actual encounter that would be too traumatic or too revealing to consciously process. The association with death and dying is strong in Hat Man lore. Some witnesses report seeing him around times of personal crisis, illness, or when death enters their life through loss of loved ones. He's been interpreted as a psychopomp, a being who appears when the barrier between life and death thins, who watches those who are approaching transition, or who are emotionally close to someone who is. In this framework, he's not necessarily malevolent, but rather performing a function related to mortality, observing, and perhaps recording or guiding. His appearance a harbinger that death is near, even if not imminent. The fear he generates might be instinctive human response to confronting something that represents or heralds our eventual fate. Children see the Hat Man with disturbing frequency, and their descriptions match adult accounts despite children having less cultural baggage and fewer preconceived notions about what shadow figures should look like. A 5-year-old describing a tall, dark man with a big hat watching from the doorway is chilling precisely because that child probably hasn't been exposed to film noir or Western archetypes that would program that specific image. Either children are particularly sensitive to whatever the Hat Man is, or the image is so fundamental to human consciousness that even young children generate it identically to adults when conditions allow him to manifest. Geographic clustering sometimes occurs, with multiple people in the same area reporting Hat Man encounters within short time periods, suggesting either localized conditions that facilitate his appearance or that he targets specific locations for reasons we can't determine. Houses where he's been seen sometimes have histories of other paranormal activity, or reports of feeling watched or unwelcome. Whether the Hat Man causes or is attracted to these atmospheres, or whether psychologically sensitive individuals who live in disturbing environments are more likely to experience the sleep paralysis conditions during which he appears, remains unclear. The technology angle is explored by some researchers who note that Hat Man sightings seem to have increased with the proliferation of electronic devices and electromagnetic fields in homes. EMF exposure has been linked to unusual neurological effects, including hallucinations, and some theorize that sleeping surrounded by electronics creates fields that interact with brain function in ways that produce consistent hallucinations. But this doesn't explain Hat Man sightings from before the electronic age. Historical accounts that describe similar figures in times when EMF exposure was minimal or non-existent, suggesting the phenomenon predates modern technology, even if technology might be making it more frequent. Encounters often include physical sensations beyond paralysis, pressure on the chest as if something is sitting or standing on you, difficulty breathing, coldness in the room that doesn't match the temperature, sensation of being touched or probed when nothing visible is making contact. These physical elements make the experience harder to dismiss as purely visual hallucination. The body is responding to something, whether that's neurological misfiring during sleep paralysis or actual presence that affects physical space and biology in measurable ways. Those who experience recurring visits from the Hat Man report that encounters sometimes escalate. The figure moves closer over successive appearances, or the sense of malevolence intensifies, or the paralysis lasts longer. Some witnesses describe developing a relationship with him, not friendly, but familiar and cyclical, as if he returns periodically to check on them for reasons that remain opaque. Others report that after initial encounters, they become sensitive to shadow figures in general, seeing multiple types of shadow entities where they previously saw none, as if the Hat Man's initial appearance opened their perception to an entire category of beings that exist alongside human reality. The question of why he wears a hat is strangely significant. Hats signify identity, profession, status in human culture. The wide-brimmed style he's consistently described wearing evokes specific archetypes: the Old West gunslinger, the private detective, the mysterious stranger. These are figures of authority, threat, justice, or judgment. Is the hat his actual appearance, or is it signaling something about his role or nature? Does he wear it to be more recognizable to human consciousness, to trigger specific associations and emotions? Or is it coincidence that what he is happens to resemble what humans interpret as a hat? Our brains taking something whose actual form we can't process and translating it into familiar objects. Skeptics point to the simple fact that tall, dark, humanoid shapes are naturally threatening to humans because they resemble predators or hostile humans. And adding a hat-like element at the top creates a more complete and therefore more frightening figure. During sleep paralysis, when the brain is hallucinating threats, it constructs the most effective fear stimulus it can generate, and a tall, dark, watching figure with distinctive headwear that makes it feel intelligent and intentional is remarkably effective at triggering terror. The consistency across cultures might reflect universal human psychology rather than a genuinely external entity. We all have similar brains that produce similar hallucinations under similar conditions of paralysis and fear. But for those who've encountered him, these explanations feel inadequate to capture the actual experience. The presence isn't vague or dreamlike. It's absolutely concrete, more real than dreams, as present as any physical person in the room. The details aren't fuzzy or uncertain. The hat, the watching, the malevolence are crystal clear. And the aftermath isn't like waking from a nightmare where relief comes quickly. It's lasting disturbance, persistent sense that something was genuinely there, that you've been noticed by something that continues to exist, whether you're aware of it or not. The Hat Man has entered popular culture sufficiently that he's recognized in creepypasta communities, horror fiction, paranormal discussion boards. This creates feedback where awareness potentially influences experience. People who know about the Hat Man might be more likely to interpret ambiguous experiences as encounters with him. But the phenomenon existed before internet communities gave it a name, documented in older accounts where people described the figure without having a cultural reference for what they were seeing. The modern naming and sharing might be amplifying the phenomenon, but the core experience appears to predate its internet fame. What remains undeniable is that across the world, independent of cultural background or exposure to paranormal media, people wake up paralyzed and see the same figure. Tall, dark, wearing a distinctive hat, standing and watching with attention that feels ancient and wrong. Whether he's a demon feeding on fear, a dimensional traveler observing humans during moments when barriers thin, an alien using disguise to obscure abduction procedures, a psychological archetype manifesting during altered consciousness, or something else entirely that doesn't fit into any category we've conceived, the Hat Man persists. He appears in bedrooms and hallways, at the foot of beds and in doorways, always watching, always silent, always wearing that unmistakable hat that makes him instantly recognizable to anyone who's seen him and makes every testimony about him ring with disturbing consistency. And somewhere tonight, in the darkest hours when sleep paralysis grips someone between waking and dreaming, he'll appear again. A figure darker than shadow, wearing a hat that shouldn't make him more identifiable, but somehow does. Standing absolutely motionless while radiating presence and intent that paralyze more thoroughly than the physiological mechanisms that have locked the victim's muscles. He'll watch with attention that feels like assessment, like cataloging, like something fundamental about the witness is being recorded or measured. And in the morning, when mobility returns and normal consciousness resumes, that person will search online trying to understand what they saw. And they'll discover thousands of accounts describing exactly the same figure, the same hat, the same watching, the same terror. They'll realize they're not alone, that the Hat Man has been appearing to people everywhere, that whatever he is has been studying humanity for reasons we'll never know unless he decides to communicate, and that being seen by him creates a connection that might bring him back, night after night, standing in the darkness, wearing his distinctive hat, watching, always watching, waiting for something we can't understand with patience that suggests he has all the time in the world, and we have only the terrifying moments of paralysis during which we're helpless to do anything except stare back and wonder what he sees when he looks at us, what he wants, and whether being noticed by something from outside our reality is a violation we'll carry forever, marked somehow by his attention, forever aware that in the darkness at the edge of vision, the Hat Man might be standing there even now, even in daylight, even when we're not paralyzed, watching from places we can't quite see with interest that will never be explained. The Mandela effect. Are we shifting between parallel realities? Thousands of people remember Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s. They remember the news coverage, the funeral, the global mourning for the anti-apartheid leader who never made it out of captivity to become South Africa's president. They remember it vividly, with specific details about where they were when they heard the news, how they felt, what the television reports showed. Except Nelson Mandela didn't die in prison. He was released in 1990, became president in 1994, and died in 2013 at age 95. The memories are completely, objectively wrong. But they're not isolated cases of poor recall. They're shared by enough people that the phenomenon has a name, coined by paranormal researcher Fiona Broome, who discovered at a conference that she wasn't alone in her false memory, that others remembered the same incorrect version of history. This is the Mandela effect, and it extends far beyond one man's death to encompass hundreds of specific, detailed memories that large groups of people share, despite those memories contradicting documented reality. The explanations range from simple psychology, memory is fallible, and people confuse similar events, to something far more disturbing. We're not remembering incorrectly, we're remembering accurately, but we're remembering a different timeline, a parallel reality we used to inhabit, before something shifted us into this one where details are slightly different, where the past has been subtly rewritten, where we're living in a world that doesn't quite match the one we were born into. The examples are numerous and unsettlingly specific. The children's book series is Berenstain Bears with an A, but massive numbers of people remember it as Berenstein with an E, can picture the cover with that spelling, have visceral certainty they read Berenstein, even though every physical copy that exists says Berenstain. The evil queen in Snow White doesn't say mirror, mirror on the wall. She says magic mirror on the wall. But the phrase everyone remembers is mirror, mirror, and they'll swear they heard it in the Disney film, even though watching the actual film proves they're wrong. Darth Vader never says, "Luke, I am your father." The actual line is, "No, I am your father." But the misquoted version is what millions remember as one of cinema's most iconic moments. The Monopoly Man doesn't have a monocle, has never had a monocle, but people clearly remember him wearing one, can visualize it with perfect clarity. These aren't vague recollections, but specific memories that feel absolutely certain, yet documentation shows they're false. The psychological explanation is well established. Human memory is reconstructive rather than reproductive, meaning we don't store perfect recordings of events, but rather reconstruct them from fragments when we recall them. This process is vulnerable to contamination from other sources, from expectations, from cultural transmission of information that wasn't in the original experience. We remember the Monopoly Man with a monocle because he resembles Mr. Peanut, who does have a monocle, and our brains conflate the two wealthy mascots. We remember Luke, I am your father, because that's how the line is always referenced in parodies and discussions. And the cultural version overwrites our actual memory of the film. We remember Berenstein because names ending in Stein are more common than Stain, so our pattern recognition systems default to the more familiar spelling. But this explanation struggles when you examine the specificity and confidence of false memories, particularly when thousands of people remember not just similar details, but identical details that are wrong in the same specific ways. The Berenstain Bears isn't just remembered incorrectly. It's remembered as Berenstein by people who grew up with the books, who read them hundreds of times, whose parents read them aloud nightly. These aren't casual misrememberings, but detailed recollections from childhood that feel completely authentic. The certainty is what unsettles. People don't remember Berenstein as a possibility or a maybe. They remember it with absolute conviction, can picture the cover, the spine, the way the letters looked, and when confronted with physical evidence that they're wrong, the cognitive dissonance is profound and disturbing. The parallel reality explanation suggests that reality isn't singular, but consists of multiple timelines or dimensions existing simultaneously, and that under certain conditions, possibly related to quantum mechanics, consciousness, or events like the activation of the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, these realities can merge, or people can shift between them. In your original timeline, it was Berenstain Bears, and Nelson Mandela died in prison, and the Monopoly Man had a monocle. But something happened, some cosmic event, or quantum fluctuation, or deliberate experiment that moved you into this timeline where those details are different. You remember the other reality because you actually experienced it. Your memories are accurate for the world you came from, but you're now in a world where the past is slightly different, and everyone who was always here thinks you're crazy for remembering things that never happened here. This theory gains traction from the observation that Mandela effects seem to have increased in frequency, or at least in awareness, since roughly 2008 to 2012, which coincides with CERN activating the Large Hadron Collider and conducting experiments that involve smashing particles at energies that create conditions similar to moments after the Big Bang. If those experiments are doing something to the structure of space-time or reality, if they're creating quantum effects that ripple outward and affect larger systems, then perhaps they're also causing timeline instabilities or mergers. Every time they run the collider, maybe realities blur slightly. Maybe people slip between versions of history. Maybe the past becomes fluid in ways that leave those of us who notice feeling displaced and gaslit by a world that insists our memories are wrong when we know they're right. Quantum mechanics provides theoretical framework that makes parallel realities plausible. The many worlds interpretation suggests that every quantum event creates branching timelines, that all possible outcomes actually occur, but in separate universes that split off from each other. In one branch, someone decided to spell the bear's name with an E. In another branch, with an A. In one branch, Mandela died in the 80s. In another, he was released and became president. These branches exist simultaneously, and if the barriers between them are permeable or can be crossed under certain conditions, then people might experience memories from multiple timelines, might carry recollections from branches they no longer inhabit. The experience of discovering you're subject to a Mandela effect is genuinely disorienting. You know what you remember. You can access the memory with clarity and detail. It feels as authentic as any other memory you possess. Then someone shows you physical evidence that contradicts your memory. The book cover that's spelled differently. The movie clip where the line is different. The Monopoly box where the man has no monocle. And reality tilts. Either your memory is catastrophically unreliable, worse than you ever imagined, and calling into question everything you think you know about your own past, or something impossible has occurred. Reality has changed, and you're one of the few people who notice because you remember how it used to be. Some Mandela effects involve geography. People remember New Zealand being in a different position relative to Australia, or South America being more directly under North America, rather than offset to the east, or countries having different shapes or sizes than they currently do. These geographic memories are particularly disturbing because maps are reference materials people consult repeatedly throughout education. If you looked at maps hundreds of times and consistently saw New Zealand in a certain position, and now maps show it somewhere else, either your spatial memory is completely non-functional or the maps have changed. And if maps have changed, then either cartographers got it wrong for decades and suddenly corrected it everywhere simultaneously, or the actual position of land masses has shifted between timelines. There are also anatomical Mandela effects. People remember human hearts being on the left side of the chest when anatomy shows it's more center left than fully left. They remember ribs protecting organs that are actually below the rib cage. They remember organs in different positions or different sizes than current medical diagrams show. These are harder to dismiss as simple misremembering because many people studied anatomy in school, have looked at diagrams, have pressed their hands to their chests to feel their heartbeat, and formed spatial memories based on where they felt it. If those memories are uniformly wrong in specific ways across thousands of people, it suggests something beyond individual error. Corporate logos are frequent sources of Mandela effects. People remember the Fruit of the Loom logo having a cornucopia despite the company insisting it never existed. They remember Chick-fil-A, spelled as Chick-fil-A or Chick-fil-A. They remember Kit Kat having a hyphen when it's actually Kit Kat with no punctuation. Ford's logo includes a curly tail on the F that many people don't remember being there. Volkswagen's logo has a line separating the V and W that massive numbers of people swear wasn't there before. These aren't obscure brands, but companies whose logos people have seen thousands of times, and yet collective memory differs from current physical reality. Film and television quotes are especially prone to Mandela effects. "Hello, Clarice" is never said in Silence of the Lambs. The actual greeting is "Good morning." Play it again. Sam is never said in Casablanca. The actual line is "Play it, Sam." Forrest Gump says life was like a box of chocolates, not life is like a box of chocolates, using past tense that most people misremember as present. The cumulative weight of these misremembered quotes across millions of people suggests either that human memory for media is astoundingly unreliable, or that we're remembering versions of these films that existed in timelines we used to inhabit before shifting to this one. Religious texts have reported Mandela effects that disturb believers who've studied scripture extensively. People remember, "The lion shall lie down with the lamb" as a biblical passage when the actual text says, "The wolf shall dwell with the lamb." They remember specific verses being worded differently, positioned in different books, or not existing at all despite clear memories of reading and discussing them. For individuals who've dedicated their lives to scriptural study, discovering that passages they memorized are different from what appears in current Bibles creates profound theological and psychological crisis. The question of why some people experience Mandela effects while others don't adds another layer of mystery. If reality actually shifted, why do only some people remember the previous version? Possible explanations include consciousness differences. Perhaps certain individuals are more sensitive to dimensional shifts, more aware when changes occur, less likely to have their memories automatically overwritten when timelines merge. Or perhaps everyone experiences the shift, but most people's brains automatically update to match the new reality, while a minority retain memories from the previous timeline due to neurological or consciousness differences that make them resistant to the update. There's also the possibility that Mandela effects are deliberate, that someone or something is intentionally editing reality, and these residual memories in a subset of the population are evidence of the editing process. Why would reality be edited? To change historical outcomes, to eliminate or create specific events, to test whether humans notice when their past is altered, or to fine-tune conditions toward a desired future. If you had technology or capability to modify timeline, you'd probably start with small changes. Brand spellings, minor geographic details, trivial quotes from films, to test whether the changes hold and whether anyone notices. The Mandela effects we're aware of might be the test runs, minor alterations that don't significantly impact history, but do reveal whether the editing process is detectable. Some researchers connect Mandela effects to CERN specifically, noting that the collider's location near Geneva, Switzerland, places it in proximity to where many Mandela effects seem to be noticed first or most strongly. CERN's logo includes what conspiracy theorists interpret as 666, and the statue of Shiva, the Hindu god of destruction, at their facility has been cited as evidence they're intentionally opening portals or destroying and recreating reality. CERN scientists dismiss this as absurd misunderstanding of particle physics. But the timing correlation between LHC activations and increased reports of Mandela effects continues to fuel speculation about connection. The psychological toll of experiencing Mandela effects is significant. When your memories conflict with physical evidence and consensus reality, you face three possibilities. You're mentally ill and experiencing false memories. Everyone else is wrong and you're right. Or reality itself is unstable. None of these are comfortable. Many people experiencing Mandela effects report feeling gaslit by the universe, questioning their sanity, becoming obsessed with documenting other potential changes, living in constant uncertainty about whether reality will shift again and what will be different next time. Online communities provide validation where people who remember the same incorrect versions of reality gather to confirm each other's memories and track new potential shifts. But this can also deepen the obsession and isolation from consensus reality. Skeptics point out that many Mandela effects can be explained through straightforward cognitive psychology. Memory is imperfect. People confuse similar things. Cultural transmission distorts information. Expectations shape recall. The fact that people make similar mistakes doesn't require parallel realities, just similar cognitive processes making similar errors under similar conditions. The spelling Berenstein looks more natural than Berenstain to English speakers, so we misremember it toward the familiar pattern. Mirror mirror sounds more poetic and repetitive than magic mirror, so we remember the better phrase rather than the actual phrase. These are features of how memory works, not evidence of dimensional shifts. But for those experiencing Mandela effects, these explanations feel insufficient. The memories are too vivid, too detailed, too specific. They're not vague impressions, but clear recollections with sensory detail, emotional content, contextual information. You don't just vaguely think it was Berenstein. You can see the book cover on your childhood shelf, remember your parents' voice saying the name, recall your young mind sounding out the letters. That level of constructed false memory for trivial details about children's books and brand logos, experienced by thousands of people in identical ways, seems to require more than just normal memory fallibility. There's also the meta question. If memory is as unreliable as the skeptical explanation requires, if we routinely fabricate detailed false memories for no apparent reason and with such consistency that thousands of us remember identical false details, then what else that we remember might be false? If you can't trust your memory about whether the Monopoly Man had a monocle or how a beloved childhood book series was spelled, can you trust your memories of your childhood, your relationships, your identity? The Mandela effect if it's purely psychological, reveals that human memory is far more fictional than we'd like to believe. If it's reality shifting, it reveals that the universe is far less stable than we assume. Either way, the implications for certainty and identity are disturbing. What makes the phenomenon particularly fascinating and frustrating is that it's unfalsifiable. There's no test that can distinguish between everyone is misremembering and reality shifted, but most people's memories updated to match the new timeline. If reality editing were perfect, we wouldn't notice at all. The fact that we notice through Mandela effects might be evidence that the editing is imperfect, that some people slip through the update process with memories intact from the previous version. Or it might be evidence that human memory is unreliable in surprisingly consistent ways. We have no method to determine which explanation is correct because both predict exactly the same observational evidence. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is the feeling that accompanies discovering you're subject to a Mandela effect. It's not just confusion or surprise. Many people describe it as visceral wrongness, as if reality has been violated, as if they're seeing evidence that the world isn't what it pretends to be. There's a sense of betrayal, of having the ground pulled out from under your epistemological foundation. If you can't trust physical evidence because it contradicts your clear memories, and you can't trust your memories because physical evidence contradicts them, what can you trust? You're left suspended between certainty that what you remember is real and evidence that it never existed, living in a kind of existential uncertainty where the past is negotiable and your mind might be carrying memories from a reality that no longer exists or never existed here. The Mandela Effect communities online document hundreds of potential examples, some more convincing than others, tracking reports of new discrepancies as people notice them. Members report feelings of displacement, of not quite belonging in this version of reality, of noticing small things that seem wrong in ways they can't articulate. They compare notes on what they remember versus what currently exists, finding comfort in shared false memories that confirm they're not alone in their experiences. But there's also paranoia. If reality can shift, how do you know it won't shift again? If the past can change, might it change in ways that erase you or people you love? The universe becomes fundamentally untrustworthy, capable of editing itself and gaslighting everyone about what used to be real. Whether the Mandela effect represents fallible human memory, producing consistent errors through shared cognitive biases, or whether it's evidence that we're living in a quantum multiverse where timelines occasionally merge or people shift between parallel realities, or whether it's proof that someone or something is actively editing reality and we're the few who notice because our memories didn't update properly. The phenomenon persists and grows. More people discover discrepancies between their memories and current reality. More examples accumulate. More individuals experience the disorienting realization that what they remember with absolute certainty never happened, at least not here, not in this timeline, not in this version of the world. And we're left wondering whether we're remembering wrong or remembering right from somewhere else, whether we were born in this reality or slipped into it from another, whether the past is fixed and our minds are broken, or whether the past is fluid and we're among the few who retain memory of what it used to be before it changed into what it is now, leaving us displaced persons from timelines that no longer exist except in memories that everyone insists are false. Despite feeling more real than anything we've experienced since the day we realized that reality doesn't quite match what we remember, that we're living in a world that's subtly wrong in ways we can document but never prove, carrying memories from a past that this world claims never happened.